Last year, Darrington Press's Daggerheart took the TTRPG world by storm. Reviewers praised its impressive production quality, innovative game mechanics, and heartfelt advice for creating a collaborative table culture, which you'd think would put it squarely on my radar. In fact, up until now, I've actually been avoiding Daggerheart. It's a big community with a very passionate fan base, and so before I said anything controversial, which I am known to do, I wanted to make sure my thoughts were clear. Well, the time has finally come. After sinking my teeth into Daggerheart's core set and quick start adventure, I can confidently say that my assessment is that Daggerheart is an Enthusiast's TTRPG. Hi, I'm John. This is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today we are unpacking my many thoughts on Darrington Press's Daggerheart. Let's get into it. Alright, I think to start, we do have to back up a bit again. Like in my Pathfinder review, I feel like a lot of the context of why I'm playing Daggerheart and even how it came about is relevant to the conversation. Back in 2022, Dungeons & Dragons was the cool TTRPG to play, in no small part thanks to the livestream Critical Role. It hit this perfect nexus of having a lot of recognizability, a large, diverse community, and an open gaming license which allowed developers of all skill levels to try to sell their own creations that were compatible with the system. And really, it's that third bullet point that I think was one of D&D's biggest draws. Not only did its recognizability and the excitement about the game make it the easiest to find a group that was willing to play, which I would argue is actually still true, but if you had any ambitions of trying your hand at being a TTRPG writer, the OGL served as a really easy on-ramp. Now, things were looking even brighter when Wizards of the Coast announced that they would be doing a rules update that was backwards compatible with 5e, which they then horrifically fumbled in January of 2023 when they tried to deauthorize the same OGL that had created this whole third-party industry around their product. Not only did it completely take the wind out of the sails of any creators that were interested in producing for their game, but for TTRPG enthusiasts, those of us that just love TTRPGs, it damaged our trust with Wizards so bad that I don't know how long it'll take to recover, if ever. If nothing else, it just helped all of their competitors by giving them this perfect opening to announce their own systems. Kobold Press announced Project Black Flag, which would go on to become Tales of the Valiant. MCDM announced what would become Drawsteel. And eventually, Critical Role's publishing branch, Darrington Press, the same group that had garnered so much popularity for D&D in the first place, announced their own system, Daggerheart. Now, in my exploration of different TTRPG systems, I've covered some games that have been made relatively recently, but are IPs that have been in the conversation since I started, like Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, and Pathfinder. Daggerheart is the first original system and IP to come out of what I call the post-OGL period. One characteristic I've noticed of a lot of these games, again including Tales of the Valiant, Drawsteel, Daggerheart, is that rather than try to appeal broadly to directly compete with D&D, they're instead created with a specific artistic vision that reflects the values of their creators when it comes to TTRPGs. For example, Daggerheart doesn't pretend to be a game about minutia. There are definitely resources to keep track of, but it's not this game where every 5-foot square matters in the same way as some D&D adventures. On the other side of things, from the brief glances I've taken of Drawsteel, that game seems to be a lot more about resource management. Do we continue fighting and get a victory, or do we take the time to rest and lose our momentum? Daggerheart really isn't interested in any of that. It's much more about having this flowing narrative and providing some tools that allow the action to keep moving. So again, just to sum up my thoughts, before moving in too deeply, I do really like Daggerheart. especially from the cultural side of things, I think a lot of the advice matches what I would advise GMs to do. And one of my concerns is that just browsing the Daggerheart Reddit a little bit, I get this sense from at least a few Daggerheart fans that they want it to be the D&D killer, that they want everyone to play Daggerheart, and why are we still playing D&D? And I totally get that frustration. When you know you've got a really fun game that works for you, you want other people to at least try what you're doing. But at the end of the day, Daggerheart is a more specific game, and I don't think it's trying to be a D&D killer. Even listening to some of the designers talk about it, they just wanted to create the best game to fit their preferred style of playing TTRPGs. So with this video, I may be kicking the hornet's nest a bit. I am not going to say to abandon your D&D games because Daggerheart is a much superior system. I think there are a lot of things Daggerheart definitely does better than D&D, but to paraphrase Mike Shea from the Lazy RPG talk show, the perfect TTRPG is the one that provides the most fun for you and your friends. And there are some specific things about Daggerheart that are going to absolutely elevate the game for some tables, but may create some complications for others. Before diving any deeper, I do want to be upfront with 3 big disclaimers. The biggest of which is that I'm not a Critical Role fan. Now that's not to say I dislike Critical Role. Actually, the Eldritch Lorecast just released an episode with Quinn's Quest as the thumbnail, making it very easy to find. And boy, there was a spicy take in the comment section about his view on Critical Role, apparently. I don't have those kind of strong feelings. I actually like a lot of the content they produce. You know, I like watching Vox Machina on Prime. I own both the Tal'Dorei original campaign setting and Tal'Dorei Reborn. It's just that the medium of TTRPG actual plays, I just have a really hard time keeping up and processing the action. A lot of times it just sounds like white noise to me. So when it comes to kind of the TTRPG specific side of things, I just would hesitate to call myself a fan. That being said, in the past, I played a good number of D&D games that were run by a Critical Role fan. Now, 99% of the time, those games were awesome, I loved what was happening, but like any game, there were these little pocket moments of friction, and when the game master and I would debrief after, it turned out those points of friction, for me anyway, resulted from them trying to rule things the way Matt Mercer would, or try a storytelling technique they saw on Critical Role, which left me with the impression that maybe I just didn't match Critical Role's style. Something that confirmed this is there would be times I sit down for sessions, and a lot of the player roster would also be Critical Role fans, and the same kind of things that would kind of bug me really excited them. So one thing I've tried to be really conscientious about is trying not to let my bias get in the way of looking at something and being like, that's just a Critical Role thing, and dismissing it out of turn. But I'm human, those moments are probably going to come up. Really, I just don't want to come off as contrarian for the sake of moving against a trend. Which brings me to my next disclaimer. This will not be a comprehensive review of Daggerheart. This is just a collection of some initial impressions I had after trying the system out for the first time. Now, if you've watched any of my other system exploration videos, then you'll know that I'm not play testing these games with a group of players. My schedule is just weird and restrictive enough that if I try to do that, it would be like 6 months between videos. So instead, I sit down as both the game master and the player characters to just kind of see both sides of the screen at the same time. This lack of time pressure or this need to try to teach other players the game really gives me space and time to digest the different mechanics and why the designers made the decisions they did, which it turns out I really needed when it came to Daggerheart's system. Now, I definitely know this is not how most of these TTRPGs were intended to be experienced, especially Daggerheart. Daggerheart is pretty firm about its identity that it is a collaborative improv storytelling game where you're supposed to be bouncing ideas off of other players. However, so far, when I experience a TTRPG solo like this, and then relay my experiences. A lot of times my takes tend to be pretty aligned with how a lot of other community members feel about specific issues I bring up. And, in my opinion, Daggerheart's greatest strength is its cultural advice that it provides game masters, which also is one of its dirtiest little secrets. Daggerheart is not the only game you can play like this. As I'm reading through the game master advice, and especially when I read advice like, let your players add to your world building, I'm like, this is how I've been running my D&D games for a while. Now, Daggerheart definitely deserves merit for codifying a lot of these ideas, organizing them, and expressing them in a really digestible way. But my point is, going into this, collection of impressions, I've experienced a lot of this cultural stuff firsthand for a while. So when I'm looking at Daggerheart, I'm more looking at how its specific mechanisms support its philosophy. Because I've been having a lot of fun playing this philosophy with a different mechanical system, D&D. One more disclaimer. When I play a new system, my preference is to run through a starter adventure, ideally written by the same publisher. For Pathfinder, it was Menace Under Otari. For Call of Cthulhu, it was The Haunting. And Daggerheart has an awesome quick start adventure, The Sablewood Messengers. Now, The Sablewood Messengers comes with pre-generated characters that have story hooks that kind of get the game going. And like Dragonbane, I decided to create my own characters for this one. Now, the Quick Start Adventure also says it can be played with as little as 2 or as many as 5 player characters. I decided to go with the minimum in this case, so I created a human warrior and a fairy wizard. And I'm really glad I did. By playing the minimum amount, it actually showcased one of Daggerheart's greatest strengths. But before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about Daggerheart's production quality. Now, I wouldn't call myself a TTRPG collector. Most of the books behind me are D&D related. But of all of the different TTRPGs I've collected so far, Daggerheart is by far the most polished. I think Dragonbane still takes the cake in terms of bang for your buck. The materials that are included are way more practical. But when I'm looking at the actual print quality and the amount of art and stuff like that, Daggerheart does come off as a little more polished. Especially since it has 2 of my favorite organizational tools, a ribbon bookmark and bleed tabs. The core set also comes with over 200 cards that allows you to track your character's mechanical benefits from your character's ancestry, heritage, subclass, and their domain powers. In Daggerheart, there are 9 domains, at least for now, that are each kind of thematic categories of powers, and each class is really just a combination of 2 of those domains. So, for example, the warrior that I mentioned I created draws on the bone and the blade domains. Bone being more about battlefield tactics and body awareness, and blade being their competency with weapons. The fairy, on the other hand, the wizard, was a combination of Codex and Splendor. Codex being magical study, Splendor being more life magic, kind of the healing stuff. Part of building your character is that you have to pick cards of your character's level that can be from one or both of those domains. So for my warrior, I picked up the Whirlwind card, and another card, I'm forgetting off the top of my head, that gives them a +1 bonus to their evade. Which leads me into my first, very minor complaint. Daggerheart begs to be a physical game. Yes, I am sure there is a wonderful VTT to allow you to play online. But the rules have all these references to tactile reminders, tokens, dice, cards. Even the Quick Start Adventure has this really neat print-outable slider that you're supposed to line up with a character sheet to help players understand what the different parts are. That part I like, but as supplements, not as defaults. So, for example, when you make a D&D character and you make a spellcaster, you have spells to prepare from a spell list. So you just flip to the spell list and you write down what spells you have. There's nothing like that on the character sheet for Daggerheart. You are just supposed to flip through the cards, which took me a while to find my cards, there are 6 decks of cards in there, but then you're supposed to like lay them out. And my particular setup is just a little more cramped. And I've also played TTRPGs where we don't have a lot of space. So just the physical spatial requirement that the game seems to require, again, I love it as a supplement, but to design the game where that's the default, it just, I don't know, I didn't like it that much. Now, the core rulebook does have an appendix that has a full reference of all the different domain cards. You can definitely get by without using them. It's just that from the conversations I've listened to before playing the game for myself, Daggerheart kind of has a reputation of being this more theater of the mind, fiction first game. And so I was surprised at the amount of physical materials that you would be assumed to be playing with. Speaking of play, let's get into the gameplay. Like D&D, Daggerheart features a roll high system, where the game master either sets or references a difficulty number, and if the player rolls equal to or above it, they succeed. Now, like D&D, Daggerheart GMs roll a d20 when it comes to resolving their rolls, but players roll 2d12, the famous duality dice. And these d12s do have to be identifiably different, because one is going to represent hope while the other represents fear. When a player makes their 2d12 roll, they succeed or fail based on the numbers added together. But if the hope die has a higher number, that player also gets a hope token, which they can spend in various ways, including to activate some of their special powers, like I said, my warrior's whirlwind. They can help an ally by describing how their character helps out, and then getting to roll a d6 to add to an ally's roll. Or each character has some experiences that kind of tie into their backstory, and a player can spend a hope to give them a +2 bonus to the roll if they can justify how their experience would aid them in this specific attempt. On the other hand, if the fear die rolls higher, then the GM gets a fear token. Adversaries or dangerous environments sometimes have special attacks or features that can be activated by spending a fear token. In combat, a GM can spend a fear token to give their adversary another turn, or they can just plain spend it to add a complication to the story to just make it more interesting. Whereas games like D&D have binary resolutions, either you succeed in your attempt or you fail, Daggerheart instead mixes it up by having 4. You could succeed with hope, which means that you succeed and you improv that it works out extra well. You could also succeed with fear. So yeah, you pass the check, but maybe things get a little more complicated in the future. You fail with fear, really bad failure, or you can fail with hope, where yeah, you don't succeed, but that doesn't mean you get stuck. Well, there's actually a 5th possibility. If the 2d12s roll the same number, it counts as a critical success, which also allows you to either gain a hope token or remove a point of stress, which is a whole other kind of health-like resource each character has. Also, like D&D, if you critically succeed on an attempt to attack, it deals extra damage. Now, something that Daggerheart is really proud of is the fact that it has asymmetrical design. And especially trying it out being both the game master and the player characters, one of the things that really struck me was how differently it felt to play both sides. Usually in TTRPGs, the trend I've noticed is that the adversaries tend to perform more consistently, or at least have tools to perform more consistently, while the player characters tend to have swingier results. So for example, in D&D, monsters have the average damage next to the dice that you would roll. So a GM can just decide to take the average instead of rolling randomly. Whereas player characters, you never know if they're going to hit or miss. Maybe an even more salient example is Dragonbane, where yes, you have to roll randomly to determine what action a monster is going to take, but if you roll an attack, the monster just automatically hits. The experiential effect from the player side of things is that sometimes there is a dissonance between the description of your character and how your character actually performs. For example, an early D&D game I played, I decided to build a fighter. And in the class description, it says, fighters are masters of weapons. And yet, through the session, I tended to roll really low. So it just felt like my fighter was bad at fighting. Because the GM in Daggerheart is rolling a d20, which is a swingy die, and the players are rolling 2d12, which has a tighter bell curve for your expected outcomes, players actually roll more reliably in Daggerheart than monsters do. So when they fail, it feels like a matter of circumstance rather than incompetence. That, and doing the math, having crits be on numbers that match also means that players in Daggerheart have a higher critical success chance than they would in another D20 fantasy game. So as a player, you do feel a little more competent, but then again, anytime you try something, you are risking that the GM is also going to acquire more fear tokens. Which I think is a good enough segue to bring me to one of Daggerheart's more controversial design decisions, the lack of initiative order. Now at this point, I've played TTRPGs that handle initiative very differently. Of course, D&D or Pathfinder have you roll a check that you can increase by building your character a certain way, and you take the turn order highest to lowest. Dragonbane, you just shuffle a deck of cards and deal them out, and whatever lowest number you get, like the person with the 1 card goes first, followed by the 2 card, and so on. And then there's elective action order, where basically one person takes their turn, but then they can choose if they're going to pass the baton to an ally or an enemy. And there are all sorts of strategic reasons why you might choose one over the other. I think it's really bold of Daggerheart to just be like, nah, you'll figure it out. As someone who's only played TTRPGs that have some kind of turn order, this is the first time during gameplay where I second-guessed whether or not I was playing the game quote-unquote right. Light spoilers for the quick start adventure going forward. In my playthrough of the Sablewood Messengers, the first combat I actually found myself in was when the 4 thistle folk are attempting to ambush the carriage. Reminded me a lot of Lost Mine of Phandelver. Actually, let me break for a second to say, I love the Sablewood Messengers as a starter adventure. I think there is a very clean template that helps newer GMs organize events in an adventure without being so restrictive that it feels like you're railroading your players. Anyway, back to the actual combat. The adventure does advise that you have a character make an instinct roll to determine whether or not the Thistlefolk are successful in their ambush attempt. Well, my warrior succeeded, partially because my fairy spent a hope to help him out and roll an advantage die, but basically it just meant that the spotlight was on the player characters first. The first character I had go was my warrior, who made an attack, got to spend the hope that he gained from that attack to activate Whirlwind. That was a very exciting opening first move to my first ever Daggerheart combat. And then I had my wizard go. She used her great staff and critically succeeded, which then left me with a, now what? As the GM, do I just have the adversaries go because they haven't gotten a chance yet? Well, I took some time researching it, and the answer is no. Of course, as the GM, I can just declare anything I want, but what I found was that the adversaries go when a player character rolls with fear, fails a roll, or the GM decides to spend a fear token. Well, at the beginning of the game, every player gets 2 hope tokens, and the GM has a number of fear tokens for each player character at the table, which means that mine started with 2. I didn't feel like spending one of my 2 fear tokens to just have one of my bandits attack, so instead my player characters just got to keep rolling. And in this case, I had the wizard, even though she just critically succeeded, attempt to intimidate the Thistlefolk to scare them off. Well, she rolled a presence check, assisted by a hope token from my warrior, and the enemies ran away. One of the justifications for a lack of a turn order in Daggerheart was so that players wouldn't feel like they have to defeat or kill all of the enemies in a combat encounter. They can try other things. They can try negotiating, intimidation. Basically, it's to free them from the thoughts of an action economy to tell a story that makes sense. And for me, this was a story that made sense. Of course, the second combat I had them in, which was the final combat of the adventure, was much deadlier. They were fighting 2 forest wraiths and a bunch of skeletons. And as the GM, I could spend a fear token to summon 2 more skeletons to fight. But whereas Pathfinder or D&D basically comes down to a numbers game, again, if it were a D&D game and I had 2 player characters fighting 6 enemies, that means there are 6 turns that they could get damaged. But in Daggerheart, the spotlight only moves to adversaries on specific conditions, which was the strength that I mentioned earlier. Even only having 2 characters, yes, they didn't have as many hit points or whatever, but it still felt like a good fight. And I do think maybe Daggerheart fans are missing something great about the game by really just trying to defeat D&D in the minds of their players. When I see groups getting frustrated that they can't get enough players together, you don't need a lot of players to play a fun game of Daggerheart. You need 3 players at the minimum, and this game was still really engaging and fair and fun. Anyways, I didn't really get to try them out, but my wizard was close to dropping to 0 hit points, which would have started Daggerheart's various death moves. I'm not going to get into specifics, but in short, when your character gets dropped to 0 hit points, that character can now decide a few different options of how to keep playing the game. One of which is to go out in a blaze of glory, or maybe they just want to try to hold steady. You can probably draw a very direct parallel from the design of 0 actions in Swiftguard to death moves in Daggerheart. They aren't exactly the same, but I did take inspiration. But yeah, even though it took a little getting used to, I personally really liked the initiative-less combat. The lack of action economy makes the game a little easier to balance. Because a player can really act at any time that their side has the spotlight, I can for sure see how there are groups of players that would be easier to engage at all times, and it is also really fragile. I had a fun time with it because the only person playing the game was me. I got to decide when it made sense for my player characters to get extra challenged or whatever. I wasn't gonna make me upset. Any system that relies on the fun being that everyone's just real cool and respectful and socially aware is going to have its vulnerabilities, especially with a community that has a reputation for being toxic, whether that reputation is deserved or not. This is really when a thought crept into my mind that maybe Daggerheart isn't the best first TTRPG. For context, there was an episode of the Eldritch Lorecast a few months ago where the co-hosts were talking about Draw Steel. You know, what it did well, what maybe some of the issues were. And one of the things that stuck out to me from that conversation is when one of them said that Draw Steel feels like a great second TTRPG, where maybe you introduce players to the hobby through something like Dungeons & Dragons or Dragonbane, and after some time, if they're ready for a little bit more crunch, then they could appreciate what Draw Steel has to offer. The more I played Daggerheart, the more that was the sense I was getting. There were a lot of very specific design decisions I really liked, but also I only liked them because I could contrast them to my experience playing other systems. That isn't to say that I think Daggerheart is a bad first TTRPG. I can absolutely see a die-hard Critical Role fan wanting to play a game that's in Critical Role's style, and getting together a group of fellow Critical Role fans and having a blast with this game out of the box as their first TTRPG. And this is also why I say Daggerheart is an enthusiast's TTRPG. More and more, I've been finding myself using 3 terms to kind of describe different players on the TTRPG journey. There are beginner players, players that have never played a TTRPG before, and thus don't really know what to expect. Maybe they've watched actual plays, or maybe they've watched an episode of The Big Bang Theory or something, but they don't really have their own experiences until they try it. Then you have casual players. There are players at my Geras table that I would describe like this. They're not looking up build videos or listening to podcasts. They enjoy sitting down and playing TTRPGs. They can even be pretty knowledgeable about the rule system, but they aren't enthusiasts that are engaging with peripherals of the hobby outside of their time at the table. Enthusiasts are people like me that love this stuff so much that we make YouTube videos about it, or we consume other YouTube videos, or we engage with punditry, or the conversation around the OGL. As much as the OGL has colored my experience of TTRPGs, there are thousands, if not maybe millions of people that have never even heard of it and don't care. So when discussing Daggerheart's candidacy as a first TTRPG, I think it's good to know how enthusiastic an individual player is about the game. For example, a few months ago, I released a video called Is D&D 5.5 a good first TTRPG? I'm still playing that campaign. One of the players that started with me is definitely casual in the most literal sense of the word. He started as merely a social thing. He doesn't really care about TTRPGs. And if we were trying to play something like Daggerheart, where there wasn't a time where it was his turn, I think he would have been perfectly happy just sitting back and kinda not playing. But because we played D&D, there was a specific time where it was his turn to do stuff. So because it was his turn, he learned that there was an action and movement. And because he was kind of, for lack of a better term, forced to contribute, well, now he's a lot livelier at the table and is still the most casual of casual. But a game like Daggerheart isn't really going to be a good match for him. Which is another thing, if I'm to speak to the Daggerheart community, not everyone is going to love it as much as you do, and it doesn't need to be a D&D killer. Let the D&D people have fun with their D&D, be welcoming and accepting of people who get really interested in Daggerheart, but there's nothing wrong with either system. It's just that both systems serve their players in different ways. Yes, I know Daggerheart has several alternative turn order solutions for this particular issue. The book itself has this suggestion of action tokens or whatever. I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't force a relationship just because you're excited about it. To just drive this whole enthusiast point home, let's look at one more mechanical part of Daggerheart: hit points. Now, D&D, Pathfinder, Dragonbane, they all handle hit points similarly to RPG video games. You have a number of points that represents your health. When you take damage, you remove that many hit points. Daggerheart actually adds an additional step. Most player characters start with 5 or 6 hit points, but damage still comes in numbers you'd recognize from D&D. 8, 12, 20 points of damage. But what you do is you compare that damage to your character's damage thresholds, which usually has to do with their armor, to determine whether that damage was minor, major, or severe. And that's how you know how many hit points you lose. So if you only take minor damage, it's only 1 of your 5 hit points. Severe is 3. There's also an additional step where your armor has a number of armor slots, and you can spend an armor slot to reduce the damage type by 1 step. So you can turn major damage into minor damage. As an enthusiast, I love this system. It makes armor matter. I think it's a compelling game choice. It prevents characters from getting one-shot unexpectedly, and that's a lot of boxes to check for someone new. Literally, you're checking boxes. And as someone who loves TTRPGs, it took me a little while to learn this system. Once I did, I really loved it, but again, even I don't think I would have appreciated it unless I'd played a little D&D and had something to compare it to. That all being said, I don't actually think Daggerheart's mechanics are even its greatest strength. The reason I would recommend the Daggerheart core set for any game master is because of its cultural advice. Having read the text myself, I get why people fall in love with Critical Role. It sounds kinda cheesy, but you can feel the love that's going into the table culture advice. It's written with a love for the TTRPG hobby and the people that play it. Or, in other words, by enthusiasts for enthusiasts. Earlier, I mentioned that maybe I just didn't match Critical Role's style. And in some ways that may be true. But I absolutely match the cultural advice that the book is giving. Let's take a look at some examples. The Golden Rule. Ignore or adjust game mechanics to fit your player's wants and needs. Rulings over rules. Don't allow nonsensical outcomes because someone is arguing the physics of a spell. Play disability with purpose and respect. This is the first one where I read it and I'm like, wow, they did a good job. Because they got authors with personal experience with each disability they write about to very respectfully go over how it impacts somebody's life and how you play that story without being disrespectful. Discover your character sounds a little bit like discover your best self through gaming, huh? Over the years, I've spoken to designers of all skill levels, with some believing that superior game design is the key to preventing issues at the table. If only they could fine-tune the game's balance or the class selection or a reroll mechanic. Ultimately, my experience has taught me the opposite. TTRPGs are a human game. They're at the best when we humans acknowledge that it is a game. We agree on what we're trying to do. And when hurt feelings or misunderstandings inevitably arrive, it's through human action that we can resolve it. In other words, perfect mechanics doesn't solve a bad table culture, but the right table culture can elevate even poorly designed mechanics. That's not to say Daggerheart has poor mechanics or anything, but rather what I really appreciate about it is that it proudly acknowledges that all the players around the table are human, and to have the best time playing these types of games means honoring the human journey. Even if you aren't a fan of a lot of the things that Daggerheart is pushing, like the players also being world builders, I still think that there's a lot of value of at least browsing the Daggerheart cultural sections and asking yourself if any of it has a place at your table. So now I want to know what you have to say. Are you a fan of Daggerheart? Did you find out about it by being a Critical Role fan? Or did you come across it independently? What are your thoughts on the turnless combat? Let me know in the comments down below. In the description, I have links for my TTRPG Swiftguard, as well as the Swiftguard Discord if you have any feedback for me. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.